History remembers empires for their victories, their monuments, their rulers, but the darkest truths of empire are rarely carved in stone. They are written on human bodies, in chains, in scars, in silence. When the Ottomans won a battle, the battlefield did not fade into quiet. It echoed with the cries of women whose fate was sealed not by swords, but by law. Tota Empira, they were not wives, not daughters, not mothers. They were Sabaya's spoils of war. And what happened next was not chaos. It was order, cold and calculated. From the moment a city fell, the machinery of conquest began its work. Specialized Ottoman officers, trained for this very purpose, walked through the ruins like merchants surveying goods. Men and women were separated with ruthless precision. The husbands, the defenders, the fathers, most were slaughtered on the spot or chained for backbreaking labor. But their wives, their fate was worse. For them, survival itself became a punishment. They were stripped not only of freedom, but of identity. Every captured woman was subject to inspection, not symbolic, but physical, degrading, and terrifyingly systematic. Ottoman officials examined their bodies as if testing livestock. Teeth were pried open to judge health, skin inspected for signs of disease, fertility quietly calculated, age, beauty, and strength became numbers on a ledger. Younger women with striking features were tagged for the capital, Constantinople. Older women, or those who showed signs of weakness, were condemned to heavy labor, kitchens, or obscurity. What once was a wife, a respected matron, a noble lady, was now reduced to a price. Imagine the humiliation. A woman who only days before had been the heart of her household, surrounded by family, was now standing in the open street, prodded and priced like cattle. Her value shouted aloud by strangers, her body judged as an object, her life recategorized as property. And this was only the beginning. The march to the markets was itself a nightmare. Long columns of chained captives, forced to walk for weeks across hostile terrain, beaten forward like animals. Some collapsed from hunger and thirst, left to die where they fell. Others were stuffed into wagons, packed tighter than sacks of grain. For many, survival to the next city was already a victory. But for those who lived, the true horror was still waiting. Because the Ottoman slave markets were not hidden dens of illegal trade. They were official, regulated, taxed institutions, integral to the empire. In cities like Constantinople, Bursa, and Ankara, women were lined up for display. Buyers inspected them with the same cold thoroughness as soldiers in the field. Potential masters touched them, tested their skills in cooking, weaving, or music, demanded smiles and submission before agreeing on a price. If a woman resisted, she was beaten, her price lowered, her humiliation deepened. Behind them, scribes kept records with chilling precision. Names, ages, origins, skills, values. These ledgers filled Ottoman archives, turning the intimate suffering of women into neat, bureaucratic paperwork. To the empire, these were not tragedies. They were assets. The most beautiful were selected for the imperial harem. But erase every image you have of silks and luxury, of romance and intrigue. The harem was not a paradise. It was a prison wrapped in gold. Thousands of women from every conquered land, Greeks, Hungarians, Slavs, Armenians, Circassians, were confined behind guarded walls, watched day and night by eunuchs. Their language, faith, and even their names were stripped away. A Christian girl might wake one morning renamed in Ottoman Turkish, forced to recite Islamic prayers, punished for any resistance. Refusal meant starvation, beatings, or confinement in blackened cells. Inside, women competed desperately for survival. A single smile from a powerful master could mean protection. A single misstep could mean abuse, isolation, or death. Some adapted, fighting tooth and nail for scraps of influence. Others fell into despair, madness, or suicide. The harem was not simply about sexual exploitation. It was psychological annihilation. It was a graveyard for identity. For the wives of noblemen, the humiliation was sharper still. If your husband had been a commander, a landowner, or a local leader, you were not hidden away in anonymity. You were paraded, forced to serve the very officers who had destroyed your family. Your degradation was not an accident. It was policy. It was a message. If we can break the noble women of your people, no one is safe. And the cruelty did not end there, because for the Ottomans, conquest was not temporary. It was generational. A woman's womb itself became another battlefield. Any child born of an enslaved mother automatically belonged not to her, but to her master. A mother was forced to raise children she could never truly claim as her own. Sons were trained as servants or soldiers. Daughters were fed into the same cycle of markets and harems. The system ensured that women's very bodies became engines of empire. Religion was another weapon. Captive Christian women were marched into humiliating conversion rituals, refused to speak the words of the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. And you faced torture, starvation, or confinement. Accept, and you are erased, cut off forever from your family and community. Even if you escaped, you could never go home. Your church would not take you back. Your people would not recognize you. Conversion was not salvation. It was annihilation of identity. This was not random cruelty. This was law. Codified, sanctioned, written into the empire's machinery. Every humiliation, every branding, every forced conversion was stamped with legitimacy. The battlefield ended in chains not because soldiers lost control, but because officials enforced order. And in that order, women became tools of domination, of warning, of empire. But what made this system even more terrifying was not just what was done to women, but what was done with them. Their suffering was public. Their humiliation became spectacle. Their pain was weaponized, not only to break them, but to terrify the people they came from. And as we peel back these layers of history, the question becomes chilling. If this was only the beginning of their ordeal, what come next? The battlefield was over. The men were gone. The city had fallen. But for the women, the war had only just begun. Conquest was not a moment. It was a process. And for the Ottomans, it was a process perfected, regulated, taxed, documented. What began in blood ended in ledgers. The suffering of women became not just tragedy, but inventory. The slave markets of the Ottoman Empire were not hidden underground dens of chaos. They were official institutions built into the empire's economy. In Constantinople, Bursa, and Ankara, auction squares buzzed with activity. Behind the noise of bargaining, a darker truth unfolded. Women stood in rows, chained, exposed under the eyes of eager buyers. A noblewoman who once commanded respect now stood trembling in a marketplace, her dignity stripped away, her worth reduced to numbers. The inspections were relentless. Buyers were permitted to touch, prod, and test as if the women were nothing more than cattle. A woman's hands were examined for signs of skill in weaving or cooking. Her posture, her teeth, even the tone of her voice could raise or lower her price. If she faltered, if she resisted, the punishment was immediate. Beatings in public, a slap across the face, a humiliating reduction in value, as though her spirit was a flaw. The humiliation was not incidental. It was deliberate. The system wanted obedience, but it also wanted submission. A woman forced to smile under threat of violence did more than please her buyer. She broadcasted a message. Resistance is futile. Behind this theater of suffering, scribes worked like accountants of misery. They recorded every detail. The woman's origin, her age, her skills, her price. Names were often erased, replaced with new ones chosen by masters. A Hungarian girl became Fatima. A Greek woman became Aisha. Erasure was the point. The empire did not just want bodies. It wanted identities destroyed. And in this paperwork, suffering became permanent. But the most beautiful captives rarely saw the open market. They were funneled into the empire's most notorious institution, the imperial harem. Forget the romantic myths of silk cushions and forbidden romance. The harem was not a paradise. It was a cage gilded in gold. Thousands of women from every conquered people were locked inside Topkapi Palace, guarded by eunuchs who patrolled the corridors day and night. Here, survival was not about strength, but about strategy. Women were forced into a brutal competition for favor. Every gesture, every word, every glance could decide their fate. A woman who pleased her master could gain protection, maybe even luxury. A woman who faltered could be beaten, starved, or cast into isolation. The harem devoured identity. Women forgot their languages. They forgot their prayers. They forgot their names. Those who refused assimilation were punished with starvation or confined in blackened cells where silence and darkness drove many to madness. It was not simply physical exploitation, it was psychological annihilation. Women who once held noble titles, women who were once the wives of commanders, were deliberately reduced to servants of the very men who had destroyed their families. The cruelty was not an accident of war. It was policy, a statement of empire. If we can break your women, we can break your people. The system did not stop with the women themselves. Their wombs became weapons. Any child born of an enslaved mother was property of the master. Sons were trained for servitude or sent into the janissary system, cut off from their heritage, raised to fight against the very people of their mothers. Daughters were raised to replace their mothers, fed back into the cycle of markets, harems, and servitude. Imagine the torment of a mother forced to cradle a child she knew she could never truly call her own. She raised him, nurtured him, whispered lullabies from a language she was forbidden to speak, knowing that one day the empire would rip him away. A daughter grew into a mirror of her own captivity, walking the same road of humiliation, her future already decided by the empire before she even understood it. The cycle was endless, and when even this was not enough, the empire turned to religion. Captive Christian women were dragged into forced conversions. These were not ceremonies of faith. They were rituals of domination. Women were ordered to recite the Islamic declaration of faith, the Shahada. Refusal meant lashings, starvation, or confinement in darkness. Acceptance meant erasure. A woman who converted could never return to her community. Her church would not recognize her. Her family would shun her. Even if she escaped, she was no longer who she had been. Conversion was not salvation. It was the final death of identity. The empire understood this well. A sword could kill a body, but conversion killed the soul. It made escape meaningless. It turned survivors into ghosts. And yet, perhaps the most chilling part of this system was its efficiency. Every act of brutality was organized, written down, stamped by officials. Judges legitimized the laws. Scribes filled ledgers. Taxes were collected on every sale. What should have been chaos was transformed into order. What should have been crimes were transformed into civilization. This was how the empire turned conquest into permanence. The battle might last a week, but the suffering of women stretched for generations. Their identities erased, their children stolen, their faiths broken. Their bodies turned into engines of empire. And this was only half the story. Because while most women were consumed by this system quietly, behind palace walls and in markets, others were turned into something darker still. Not just victims, not just property, but public warnings, living banners of defeat, dragged through the streets, branded and broken in front of their own people. The empire had perfected private domination, but it also knew how to weaponize public humiliation. And that is where the story turns even darker. If private suffering broke the spirit of women, public humiliation broke the spirit of nations. For the Ottomans, domination was not enough. It had to be seen. It had to be performed. It had to echo through the streets like a warning bell to every subject, every rebel, every child who might dream of freedom. The markets and harems destroyed women quietly, but in the public squares, their suffering became theater. The message was simple. Resist us, and this is your fate. Branded flesh was one of the empire's cruelest symbols. Iron rods, heated until they glowed red, pressed into the skin of captives. The mark burned deeper than scars. It was a declaration. You are property. You are no longer human. Women branded on their shoulders, arms, or even faces could never escape. Even if they fled, the mark gave them away. Even if they survived, the world would never forget. A single burn was turned into a lifelong sentence of shame. But branding was not always done in private. In city squares, entire groups of women were lined up, forced to endure the hiss of hot iron under the gaze of a crowd. Children watched as their mothers screamed. Husbands, if they lived, were sometimes forced to witness the marking of their wives and daughters, powerless to stop it. This was not just cruelty. It was propaganda, a spectacle designed to paralyze resistance before it could begin. Other punishments were crafted with equal precision. Women accused of defiance were paraded through the streets, chained together, stripped of dignity. The conquerors turned human beings into symbols of submission. The more noble the captive, the harsher the humiliation. A princess was worth more as a broken image than as a silent slave. Her downfall reminded all that even the highest-born woman could be dragged into the dust. The empire excelled in weaponizing choice. Women were cornered with impossible decisions. Abandon your faith, or watch your children starve. Submit to your master, or endure isolation and darkness. Every choice was a no-win situation, designed to break not just the body, but the very concept of free will. To force a woman to betray her God, her family, or herself was more effective than any sword. A broken spirit needed no chains. And yet, the cycle extended even further. The children born of this system carried invisible scars. Sons, torn from their mothers, grew up in barracks, trained to fight for the empire that enslaved their own bloodline. Some were forced into the Janissary Corps, their Christian origins wiped away, their loyalty redirected. When they raised their swords, they often fought against the very villages their mothers had come from. Mothers wept, not just for their lost children, but for the day those children would return as enemies. Daughters were no less. From birth, they were groomed to serve, raised under the gaze of eunuchs and masters, denied the warmth of free families. They inherited the silence of their mothers. They learned early that tears solved nothing, that obedience was survival. And so, a generation of women grew up believing captivity was normal, that servitude was destiny. The empire did not just enslave women, it trained women to accept enslavement. But what about those who resisted? Resistance existed, but it was crushed with fury. Women who attempted escape were hunted. Ifkate were paraded publicly, whipped until their backs were ribbons of flesh, then thrown into pits of isolation. Some disappeared entirely, never seen again. Others were executed as examples. Death was not just punishment, it was performance. Each fallen woman was a stage play of power, a living, bleeding message etched into the memory of the crowd. And yet, the empire's cruelty was clever. It did not want martyrs. It wanted silence. Executions were rare compared to the more insidious punishments: isolation, starvation, branding, and forced conversion. A dead captive could inspire rebellion. A broken captive inspired despair. Over generations, the echoes of this system became ingrained in conquered lands. Families whispered stories of grandmothers stolen by the Turks, of noblewomen turned concubines, of mothers who disappeared into harems, never to return. These stories were not just memories, they were wounds passed down. Trauma became heritage. Fear became culture. Think of the psychological legacy. Villages that taught daughters to hide at the sound of hoofbeats, mothers who whispered prayers whenever the empire. Officials rode into town fathers who felt shame not only for being conquered but for failing to protect their women. Conquest was not an event. It was a shadow stretching across centuries. Even today, traces of that shadow linger in folklore, in songs, in legends told at night. In every culture touched by the empire's expansion, stories remain of women stolen, broken, or erased. These stories survived because the victims could not, where voices were silenced, memory spoke instead. And that memory tells us something chilling. The Ottomans built an empire not only with armies and cannons, but with the bodies and souls of captive women. Each scar was a brick, each scream was mortar, each broken family was a foundation stone. The empire stood because women were made to fall. This was the real harem, not a palace of silk and beauty, but a machine of domination. This was the real market. Not a lively bazaar, but a graveyard of freedom. This was the real conquest, not just of land, but of identity itself. And so, when we look back at the Ottoman Empire, we must strip away the golden myths, the romantic tales, the soft images painted by later generations. What lies beneath is harsher, colder, and far more human. It is the story of women stolen, silenced, and sacrificed. A story too often forgotten. A story we cannot afford to forget again.